a 22-year-old widow, thought she had found nothing more than a job cooking for a merchant caravan crossing the American frontier. But when ruthless bandits attacked, she risked her life to save the caravan's leader, never imagining he had been quietly searching for a woman strong enough to become his wife and the mother of his children. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from. And if you enjoy heartfelt stories of love, faith, and second chances, please subscribe to the channel. A mild spring wind carried the scent of damp earth across the endless prairie as a merchant caravan slowly rolled westward from Missouri toward Oregon beneath a pale morning sky. Grace Miller stood quietly beside the cook wagon, tightening the faded apron around her waist before another long day began. At 22, she was a slender young widow with chestnut hair gathered into a simple braid beneath a worn bonnet. Her soft gray eyes held a quiet sadness that never completely faded, while her fair skin had been browned by weeks beneath the open sky. She was not the sort of woman people turned to admire, yet there was a calm dignity in the way she carried herself. Ever since her husband had died from consumption the previous winter, she had owned nothing except a small suitcase, a few cooking utensils, and the determination never to survive on pity again. Cooking for a merchant caravan of more than 30 men had become her only chance to earn an honest living. Every wagon carried bolts of cloth, farming tools, medicine chests, barrels of flour, and other valuable supplies bound for the growing settlements of Oregon. Grace knew the journey would be long, dangerous, and unforgiving, but uncertainty frightened her less than returning to a lonely town where no one was waiting. The caravan belonged to Thomas Reed. At 42, Thomas was a tall, broad-shouldered man with thick dark brown hair streaked lightly with silver around his temples. A neatly trimmed beard framed his strong jaw, and weathered blue-gray eyes reflected years of responsibility rather than anger. Most men obeyed him because he never wasted words or raised his voice. 2 years earlier, losing his wife had quietly changed him, leaving behind a man who trusted duty more than hope. When Grace first asked for work, Thomas studied her only once before speaking. "Can you feed 30 hungry men for months?" "I can. The trail won't show you mercy." "I'm not asking for mercy." He nodded once, and the matter was settled. The days quickly settled into an exhausting rhythm. Grace woke long before sunrise to knead bread, grind coffee, fry bacon, and prepare beans before the wagon started moving. Smoke stained her sleeves black while burns marked her hands, but she never complained. Most of the merchants simply called her Cookie. Few bothered to remember her name. Among them was Samuel Brooks, an 18-year-old wagon hand whose freckled face still carried traces of childhood. His sandy blonde hair constantly fell across kind hazel eyes, and homesickness often silenced his cheerful nature. Whenever fresh biscuits came from the oven, Grace quietly slipped the softest one onto his plate without saying why. Another traveler was Jacob Turner, a gray-haired merchant nearing 50, with a neatly trimmed white beard and gentle brown eyes that revealed decades of honest trade. He spoke little, treated everyone politely, and once thanked Grace for every meal she served. Later that evening, she noticed the elbow of his work shirt had torn open. After everyone had fallen asleep, she quietly stitched the fabric before placing it neatly beside his blanket. From horseback, Thomas noticed everything. At first, he watched only to make certain the new cook would not slow the caravan. Instead, he found himself noticing the fairness with which she divided every meal, the patience hidden inside every small kindness, and the quiet strength of a woman who expected nothing in return. 7 days after leaving Missouri behind, dark clouds swallowed the spring sky, and cold rain turned the wagon trail into a river of sticky mud. Wheels sank deep into the ground, horses strained against heavy harnesses, and every bundle of firewood collected along the way became soaked beyond use. By dusk the merchants had accepted that supper would be nothing more than cold bread and dried meat. Grace Miller quietly climbed beneath the cook wagon instead of joining the complaints. Months earlier, while preparing for the journey, she had packed a small cedar box filled with dry tinder, wrapped carefully inside waxed cloth beneath the driver's seat. It was something her late husband had always insisted upon before traveling. As the wind whipped across the prairie, She knelt in the mud, shielding the tiny spark with both hands until a fragile flame finally survived. Slowly, she fed it twigs no thicker than her fingers before placing a Dutch oven above the growing fire. Within an hour, the rich smell of hot vegetable soup and fresh coffee drifted through the miserable camp. The grumbling stopped almost immediately. Thomas Reed stepped toward the wagon carrying his dented tin cup. Rainwater clung to the brim of his weathered hat, while droplets slid through the neatly trimmed beard along his square jaw. His broad frame looked almost carved from the same timber as the wagon itself, yet his tired blue-gray eyes softened as they rested on Grace. "Thank you, Grace." It was the first time he had spoken her name. Grace looked up in surprise. She answered with only a small nod, because she feared her voice might betray the emotions rising inside her. For nearly a year, she had grown accustomed to being invisible. Those two simple words reached a place inside her heart she believed had died together with her husband. Nothing changed openly after that night, yet everything became different. Whenever the caravan stopped, Thomas quietly pitched his own tent where it blocked the strongest prairie wind from reaching the cook wagon. When icy streams crossed the trail, he dismounted without hesitation and offered Grace his steady hand before helping anyone else. He never lingered afterward or waited for gratitude. His kindness always arrived without drawing attention to itself. One peaceful evening, after every merchant had finished supper, Grace noticed Thomas sitting beside the fading campfire with a block of walnut wood balanced across one knee. Using only a pocketknife, he patiently carved while saying almost nothing. His rough hands, hardened by decades of ranch work and endless travel, moved with remarkable care. When he finally stood, he walked to the cook wagon and placed a smooth wooden handle beside her largest soup kettle. "The old one won't survive another month," he said quietly. Grace ran her fingertips across the polished walnut. It fit perfectly in her palm. No one had repaired something simply because it mattered to her in a very long time. From that evening forward, she began noticing the man behind the title of caravan leader. She watched Thomas take the final night watch almost every evening so younger men could sleep longer before another exhausting day. She saw him patiently calm a frightened draft horse after its harness snapped, speaking to the trembling animal with the same steady voice he used when giving orders. Every morning he personally inspected every wagon axle, wheel, and cargo strap before allowing the caravan to move, believing that overlooked details often became deadly mistakes. One quiet sunset, while orange light settled across the prairie, Thomas finally spoke about the life waiting beyond the trail. "I have 2 children at my ranch in Oregon," he said while staring into the fire instead of at Grace. "Ethan is 9. He tries to act older than he is. Lily is 6. She smiles less than she used to." Grace remained silent, allowing him to continue. "My wife died from pneumonia 2 winters ago. Since then, the house has been quiet." The pause that followed carried more weight than the words themselves. "I've met women who admired my land," Thomas continued. "Some admired my business. None ever asked about my children." Grace understood that loneliness. She remembered how quickly neighbors had stopped visiting after her husband's funeral. Pity faded faster than grief. "I suppose," she answered softly, "children know when they're being loved and when they're being managed." Thomas finally looked toward her. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. They were simply 2 people who had survived losing someone they believed they would never have to live without. The fire crackled gently between them, but neither hurried to fill the silence. For the first time since the journey had begun, silence no longer felt empty. The caravan had traveled nearly 3 weeks when the open prairie slowly gave way to rolling hills lined with scattered cottonwoods. The days remained peaceful, but the long journey wore heavily on tired bodies and restless tempers. By evening, many of the merchants sought comfort wherever they could find it, and not every man carried hardship with dignity. Among them was Henry Cole, a 35-year-old teamster with a heavy muscular build, thick black hair hanging beneath a battered hat, and a coarse beard that rarely saw a razor. A faded scar crossed one cheek, earned years earlier during a saloon fight that had become a point of pride instead of shame. Henry worked hard, but whiskey sharpened the bitterness already living inside him. He believed wagon trains belonged to men alone, and never missed an opportunity to remind Grace that she was an outsider. That night, after supper, most of the caravan had already settled around small campfires. Grace remained beside the cook wagon, quietly washing blackened pots beneath the pale light of the moon. She enjoyed these lonely moments because silence demanded nothing from her. Bootsteps crunched across the dry grass. Henry staggered into the circle of firelight with a half-empty flask swinging from one hand. The sharp smell of whiskey reached Grace before he spoke. "You work too hard for people who barely notice you," he slurred with a crooked grin. "A pretty smile would earn you an easier life." Grace continued scrubbing the kettle without looking up. "I said I heard you." Henry stepped closer until his shadow covered hers. Suddenly he caught her wrist. "You could at least be friendly." Grace calmly met his eyes for the first time. "Let go." Her voice remained soft, but there was no fear inside it. Henry laughed. Then another voice emerged from the darkness. "She gave you an order." Thomas Reed stepped into the firelight with the quiet confidence that never required raised voices. His broad shoulders blocked the lantern behind him, while his blue-gray eyes rested on Henry with absolute calm. "Take your hand off her." The words carried no anger, only certainty. Henry released Grace immediately. "I was only joking." "No," Thomas answered. "You were forgetting who you are." The camp had fallen completely silent. One by one, the merchants looked toward the cook wagon. Thomas faced every man instead of only Henry. "From tonight forward, her name is Grace Miller. You will use it." No one answered. "If you ask for food, you will ask politely. If she speaks, you will listen with the same respect you expect for yourselves." His eyes returned to Henry. "You will take every final watch for the next 7 nights. If you disrespect Grace again, you will leave this caravan before sunrise, whether we're beside a town or alone in the wilderness." Henry lowered his head. "Yes, sir." Without another word, he disappeared into the darkness. Grace stood motionless, unable to remember the last time anyone had defended her in front of others. Ever since becoming a widow, people had either pitied her or ignored her. Thomas had done neither. He had simply treated her dignity as something unquestionable. The following days felt strangely different. The merchants began calling her Grace instead of Cookie. Jacob Turner tipped his hat each morning when collecting breakfast. Samuel Brooks openly thanked her after every meal, no longer embarrassed to speak kindly where others could hear. Grace herself changed in quiet ways she barely noticed. When serving supper, she placed the largest slice of smoked beef onto Thomas's plate without thinking. His heavy trail coat had torn along one sleeve while repairing a wagon wheel, and after everyone slept, she carefully stitched the thick canvas together with strong waxed thread. Each dawn she poured 1 mug of black coffee before anyone else arrived, because she already knew exactly how he preferred it. Thomas never mentioned these gestures. Instead, he often sat near the cook fire after supper while sharpening tools or repairing harness straps. Sometimes he described the pine forests surrounding his Oregon ranch, rivers so clear that stones could be counted beneath the water, and snowy mountains glowing pink beneath the evening sun. Grace rarely interrupted. She simply listened. She realized that Thomas never spoke about land, money, or success. He spoke about home. Neither of them ever mentioned love. They did not need to. Some feelings grew stronger in the quiet places between words, where respect slowly became trust, and loneliness no longer had to be carried alone. Only 2 weeks remained before the caravan would reach Oregon, when the trail narrowed into Black Rock Pass, a rugged canyon where towering cliffs blocked the morning sun, and every echo lingered longer than it should. The merchants spoke less as their wagons rolled between the dark stone walls. Even the horses seemed uneasy. Thomas Reed rode several yards ahead of the lead wagon, studying the dusty ground. Fresh horseshoe prints crossed the trail, far too many to belong to hunters or travelers. They had been made only hours earlier. He quietly raised his hand. "Stay close." No wagon brakes formation. Grace felt a knot tighten inside her stomach. She had learned to trust Thomas's instincts. When he sensed danger, it was rarely wrong. The warning came too late. A sharp rifle shot exploded from the cliffs. Horses reared. More than a dozen armed riders appeared above the canyon walls before galloping down both slopes, cutting off every escape. Their leader guided a massive black horse with complete confidence. Walter Kane was a man of nearly 40, tall and powerfully built, with long dark hair brushing his shoulders and a thick beard streaked with early gray. A deep scar split one eyebrow, leaving his cold green eyes permanently narrowed. Years of robbing wagon trains had made him fearless, while the hanging of his younger brother had hardened every trace of mercy that once existed inside him. His men followed him not because they respected kindness, but because they feared disappointing him. Walter smiled without warmth. "Leave the money, the rifles, the medicine, and the powder wagon." Thomas slowly shook his head. "This caravan keeps moving." The first volley answered him. Gunfire echoed through the canyon as bullets struck wagons, shattered crates, and sent frightened horses pulling wildly against their harnesses. Merchants scrambled behind barrels while returning fire from every direction. Grace remained beside the cook wagon until she noticed movement behind the valuable supply wagon. One bandit had slipped away from the fight, carrying a burning torch. He wasn't trying to steal the cargo. He intended to destroy it. Without stopping to think, Grace lifted the largest kettle from the fire and threw the boiling water across the man's chest. He screamed and dropped the torch before collapsing into the dust. Grace immediately seized a knife from the cook table and cut the harness ropes, securing the 2 draft horses pulling the powder wagon. Startled but unharmed, the horses bolted forward, dragging the wagon beyond the reach of the spreading flames before another outlaw could stop them. Across the canyon, Thomas fired twice before a bullet tore through the sleeve of his coat, grazing his left shoulder. The impact threw him behind a broken freight crate. Walter saw him fall. Drawing his revolver, the outlaw leader strode toward the wounded caravan master. Grace's heartbeat pounded so violently she could barely breathe. Several feet away lay a rifle beside an injured merchant who had lost consciousness. She had never fired a weapon at another human being. She whispered a silent prayer before lifting it. Walter continued walking. Grace knew she could never make the shot. Then her eyes found an oil lantern hanging beside a supply wagon, only a few feet behind him. She squeezed the trigger. Glass exploded. Burning oil burst across the ground with a roar. Walter's horse reared violently while several nearby mounts panicked, snapping reins and crashing into one another. Bandits shouted in confusion as frightened horses scattered across the narrow pass. Grace didn't waste the moment. "Samuel! Jacob! This way!" Samuel Brooks grabbed another rifle while Jacob Turner collected spare ammunition. Together, they hurried behind a line of boulders overlooking the opposite side of the canyon. Following Grace's instructions, they fired from 3 different positions several seconds apart. The echo rolling through Black Rock Pass multiplied every shot until it sounded like dozens of riflemen had suddenly arrived. Walter cursed loudly. "We're surrounded. Fall back." His riders hesitated. That single hesitation changed everything. Thomas forced himself to his feet despite the burning pain in his shoulder. Forward! The merchants charged together, shouting as one. Believing reinforcements had reached the canyon, Walter finally signaled the retreat. Within moments, the surviving bandits disappeared into the rocky hills, leaving behind abandoned supplies and fading hoofbeats. Silence slowly returned. Smoke drifted above shattered wagons, while exhausted men lowered their rifles one by one. Grace stood beside the rescued powder wagon, her dress streaked with soot, her hands trembling uncontrollably from fear she had refused to feel during the battle. Thomas looked across the ruined campsite until his eyes found her. For the first time he realized the quiet woman who had once stood unnoticed behind the cook wagon possessed a courage greater than many armed men. The camp remained unusually quiet after the battle at Black Rock Pass. Lanterns glowed softly between damaged wagons while injured men rested beneath blankets, grateful simply to have survived. Grace Miller moved from one person to another with clean cloth, warm water, and steady hands, tending cuts and burns as naturally as she had prepared meals. When she finally reached Thomas Reed, he was sitting alone beside the cook wagon, his left shoulder stained with dried blood where the bullet had grazed him. Without a word, Grace knelt beside him and carefully removed the torn fabric around the wound. Thomas watched her work in silence. Her fingers were rough from months of labor, yet every movement was remarkably gentle. "I thought today might be my last," he admitted quietly. Grace tied the clean bandage before answering. "So did I." A faint smile crossed his weathered face. For a long moment neither spoke. The crackling fire filled the silence until Thomas finally lifted his eyes to meet hers. "When I accepted this journey," he said, "moving cargo to Oregon wasn't my only reason." Grace looked at him, confused. "My ranch has been missing something since my wife died. Not furniture, not money." He paused, choosing each word carefully. "A heart." He took a slow breath. "I hoped that somewhere along this trail I might meet a woman strong enough to stand beside me, and kind enough to love 2 children who still miss their mother every day." Grace lowered her gaze. Thomas continued, "I never imagined she would be standing behind the cook wagon." Emotion tightened inside Grace's chest before she could stop it. "You don't truly know me," she whispered. "I've watched you for weeks," Thomas answered calmly. "I've seen you rise before everyone else and sleep after everyone else. I've seen you feed hungry men before feeding yourself. I've seen you comfort frightened people without asking for recognition. Yesterday I watched you risk your life to save mine." He gently reached for her work-worn hand. "I don't need a servant." His fingers tightened slightly. "I need a partner." Grace felt tears gathering despite every effort to remain composed. "I cannot replace your wife. I would never ask you to." His answer came immediately. "I don't want another Mary. I want Grace." Before she could respond, footsteps approached the fire. Henry Cole stood several yards away, still carrying visible shame from his punishment, yet pride had not completely left him. "So the great caravan leader plans to marry the cook?" He muttered loudly enough for nearby merchants to hear. Several conversations stopped. Thomas slowly rose to his feet despite the pain in his shoulder. His voice remained calm. "This woman has a name." He looked directly at Henry. "Grace Miller." Then he turned toward the gathered caravan. "You've all watched her work from before sunrise until after dark. You've eaten meals she prepared in rain, dust, and exhaustion. She cared for injured men before thinking of herself. Yesterday she protected our powder wagon, saved our supplies, and very likely saved my life," no one interrupted. Thomas continued, "If courage, kindness, and loyalty are not enough to earn respect, then none of us deserve it." His gaze returned to Grace. "I am proud to ask this woman to become my wife." Silence settled over the camp. Jacob Turner slowly removed his hat. Samuel Brooks smiled openly for the first time since the attack. Even Henry lowered his head without another word. Grace looked around the circle of familiar faces before returning her eyes to Thomas. "I will marry you," she said softly, "but only if I come to your home as your equal. Your children deserve honesty. I will never ask them to forget their mother." Thomas's smile carried more relief than triumph. "I wouldn't have accepted any other answer." 3 weeks later the caravan reached Oregon. Thomas's ranch rested beneath tall pine forests with snow-covered mountains rising beyond green valleys. Waiting on the porch stood Ethan Reed, a serious 9-year-old boy with dark brown hair, thoughtful blue eyes, and a quiet nature shaped by losing his mother too young. Beside him hid Lily Reed, a gentle 6-year-old girl with long golden curls, bright blue eyes, and a shy smile that rarely appeared before strangers. Grace never asked either child to call her mother. She simply cooked warm meals, read stories beside the fireplace each evening, and waited patiently. One cold autumn week, Ethan became dangerously ill with a high fever. Grace remained beside his bed for 2 days and nights, bathing his forehead, feeding him broth, and refusing to leave even when exhaustion blurred her vision. When the fever finally broke, Ethan reached out and quietly took her hand. Later that afternoon, Lily shyly placed a small bundle of wildflowers into Grace's lap before curling against her shoulder and falling asleep. A year later, laughter echoed through the once silent house. Fresh bread filled the kitchen with warmth, and another small cradle rested beside the fireplace. Standing together on the porch at sunset, Thomas understood that the greatest treasure his caravan had ever carried had never been inside the wagons. It had been walking beside them all along, Every story ends, but perhaps its meaning continues in the quiet moments of our own lives. Sometimes the strongest people are not the loudest or the most admired. They are the ones who keep showing kindness when no one is watching. We never truly know what burdens another person is carrying, or how one small act of compassion might change the course of someone's life. If this story touched your heart, we'd love to hear from you. Share your thoughts in the comments. Tell us where you're watching from, and consider sharing this story with someone who could use a little hope today. If you enjoy stories of love, courage, faith, and second chances, please subscribe and join our growing community. Until we meet again, may God bless you, protect your family, fill your home with peace, and keep hope alive in your heart. Thank you for watching.